Ever catch one of those headlines? You know, the ones that just scream power dynamics and decisions being made way outside the public eye.
Hmm.
Well, a recent EU court ruling did exactly that. It's really pulled back the curtain on a pretty fascinating and definitely controversial situation.
Yeah, I saw that.
So today we're doing a deep dive into something a lot of you have asked about, the controversy surrounding Ursula von der Leyen. You've sent in this really compelling set of articles and reports,
Right.
and our mission basically is to unpack the core issues here.
Exactly. We're focusing on the information you've shared, trying to understand the main areas of scrutiny. And what really emerges are two distinct phases, it seems, in Mrs. von der Leyen's career that have drawn a lot of attention.
Okay, what are those?
Well, first, her time as Germany's Minister of Defense, and second, her more recent role as President of the European Commission.
Right, okay. So the goal is to get a handle on the central allegations in both periods, and maybe most importantly, the legal and political fallout. It seems logical to start, well, chronologically, back in Germany.
Agreed. So from 2013 to 2019, Ursula von der Leyen was Germany's Minister of Defense, and that period was significantly marked by what became known as the Berater Affair.
The Berater Affair.
Yeah, essentially the consultants' affair. It really highlighted some potential, let's say, systemic weaknesses in German procurement, and it definitely raised questions about accountability for high-ranking officials.
The Berater Affair. Okay.
Yeah.
So what exactly was at the heart of it? What were the allegations, according to our listener sources, that grabbed so much attention?
Well, the central issue, the main point of contention, was the awarding of these multi-million euro consultancy contracts. We're talking big firms like McKinsey, Accenture,
Okay.
and the allegation is that these were awarded without going through the proper legally required public tendering process.
Ah, okay. And public tendering, that's key for transparency, right? To make sure taxpayer money isn't misused.
Precisely. It's meant to ensure fairness, competition, openness. Bypassing it is a big deal.
So breaking the standard rules for, huge sums of money, what kind of criticisms did this actually spark around the process itself?
They were pretty varied. Sources point to accusations of deliberately getting around the regulations, a real lack of transparency in how these specific firms were picked, and also concerns about maybe overly close relationships, between ministry staff and these external consultants.
I see. Cozy relationships.
Possibly. And then there were questions about oversight. Was anyone really watching to make sure the money was used effectively, economically?
And this wasn't just like internal whispers, was it? I remember there was quite a political storm.
Oh, absolutely. A full parliamentary inquiry was set up. It ran from 2019 into 2020, specifically looking into these allegations.
Right. And Ms. von der Leyen herself had to testify.
She did. She appeared before the inquiry, but she maintained that she wasn't personally responsible for the problems they found.
Okay, denied personal responsibility. But that wasn't the only thing adding fuel to the fire, was it? I vaguely recall something about digital messages.
Yes, exactly. The issue of accidentally deleted emails from her time as minister. That really intensified the criticism.
Understandably.
Yeah, it led to questions about transparency, obviously, and whether potentially crucial information for the inquiry was maybe being withheld. It's quite striking, actually, how this theme of deleted communications pops up in both her German and EU roles based on these reports.
Interesting parallel. Okay, so we have the core allegations, the political reaction. Now, to get a real sense of how this played out at the time, our listeners shared perspectives from several news outlets. Let's start with Spiegel Online. What was their take?
Well, Spiegel Online, generally offering a more critical view, reportedly accused Ms. von der Leyen of factual complete failure. Pretty strong language. They essentially held her ultimately responsible for the mess with the contracts.
Wow. Complete failure. That's blunt. Was there a counter-narrative? What did other sources say?
Well, ZID Online, for instance, reported something different. They said that while the opposition parties definitely saw a significant co-responsibility on her part,
Okay.
the governing coalition at the time, that was the CDU and the SPD, they largely cleared her, exonerated her. So it really highlights the political split in how the same facts were interpreted.
Right, a clear partisan divide then. Interesting. What about the other outlets our listener mentioned?
The Süddeutsche Zeitung offered a slightly different angle. They suggested that, well, maybe using external consultants was justifiable sometimes, but that many of the problems identified happened sort of below her level, not her direct responsibility. However, Handelsblatt, another paper, highlighted the really strong critical stance from the Taxpayers Association about the spending.
Okay, the taxpayer watchdog group.
Exactly. And finally, Tagesspiegel painted this picture of real unhappiness within the Bundeswehr itself, the armed forces. They reported on the huge sums going to McKinsey and also specifically mentioned the role of Ketrin Suter, who was brought into the ministry during von der Leyen's time there.
Right. So quite a spectrum of views, from direct blame to systemic issues, maybe lower-level mistakes. Now, beyond just the consultancy contracts, were there other big criticisms of her leadership at the Ministry of Defense?
Oh, yes. Several sources point to broader concerns about the overall state of the Bundeswehr when she was in charge.
Like what specifically?
Worries about the poor operational readiness of key equipment. You often heard examples like planes not flying, tanks not rolling, submarines not sailing.
Not ideal for a defense force.
Hardly. And there were also reports of pretty significant dissatisfaction among the troops themselves, a feeling that promised reforms weren't really happening or weren't effective.
And what about the internal culture, the relationship between command and the soldiers? That was also an issue, wasn't it?
Precisely. There were these public accusations about instances of indiscipline, even right-wing extremism within the ranks.
Serious stuff.
Very serious.
Yeah.
And some sources suggest soldiers felt they weren't getting enough support from the leadership to really tackle these problems head on. Plus, there was this recurring theme, again, of relying too much on external consultants, maybe instead of building up and using the expertise already inside the Bundeswehr.
Okay, so a picture emerges of not just these financial questions around consultants, but also deeper, more systemic challenges within the military itself during her tenure. Right, let's shift gears then. Let's move to the second major area. Her current role as president of the European Commission and this whole Pfizergate controversy, this feels more recent, obviously, but just as significant.
Absolutely.
So moving from German politics to the EU stage, did any of those earlier themes, transparency in contracts, handling sensitive information, did they resurface here with Pfizergate, according to the sources?
Very much so. The Pfizergate scandal, as it's commonly called, really centers on what many see as a lack of transparency, specifically in the communication between Ms. von der Leyen and the CEO of Pfizer, Albert Bourla.
Bourla, right.
Especially during that critical time when they were trying to secure COVID-19 vaccines for the EU. The whole scandal really underscores this tension between needing to act fast in a crisis, like a pandemic.
Yeah, the urgency.
And the absolute need for transparent government and careful use of public money.
And the core of this controversy is that enormous vaccine procurement deal, right?
Exactly. We're talking about a multi-billion euro agreement.
Yeah.
Sources mentioned potentially up to 1.8 billion doses, the estimated value. Around 35 billion, just massive numbers.
35 billion euros. What?
And the heart of the issue, the allegation, is that the early crucial negotiations for this huge deal happened largely through private text messages, SMS, and phone calls.
Private texts and calls for a deal worth 35 billion. That immediately rings alarm bells about openness, accountability.
It does.
Was there any kind of standard public tender process for this contract?
Well, the information we have suggests that there wasn't a conventional public tender, and very little public disclosure about the details of these really high-stakes negotiations. Given the sheer scale and cost, that lack of transparency became, understandably, a major point of criticism.
Which leads us right to that recent EU Court of Justice ruling, the one that's brought this all back into the spotlight. What exactly did the court decide on May 14th, 2025? This feels pretty significant.
It is significant. The EU court ruling really asserts the importance of transparency in these high-level EU deals, even in a crisis. Crucially, the court ruled that the European Commission must disclose the text messages exchanged between Mrs. von der Leyen and Mr. Bourla.
They must disclose them. And the EU Court of Justice, just to remind people, that's the top court in the EU, right? Interpreting EU law?
That's correct. It's the highest court, ensuring EU law is applied uniformly. So this ruling really highlights its role in upholding principles like transparency within the EU institutions themselves.
But the Commission initially pushed back, didn't they? What was their argument against releasing the texts?
Their initial stance was, essentially, either that such texts didn't exist, or if they did, they were short-lived ephemeral, and so they didn't fall into the EU's rules for archiving and transparency.
Short-lived. For negotiating a multi-billion euro deal.
Well, the court flatly rejected that argument. The ruling was actually quite critical of the Commission's approach here. It really emphasized how important proper documentation and transparency are, especially for significant government communications like this.
And the lawsuit itself, that came from the media, didn't it?
Yes, the legal challenge was brought by a journalist, Martina Stevens-Gridniff, representing the New York Times. This came after they reported back in April 2021, hinting at these personal exchanges.
Right.
And then the commission refused to grant access to the documents when asked.
So the court basically came down on the side of public access to information here.
Ugh.
Okay, stepping back, what are the main criticisms being leveled about these vaccine negotiations overall?
The criticisms consistently focus on that lack of transparency, the sort of secret nature of the negotiations.
Right, the secrecy.
Also, the lack of a public tender for such a massive spend of taxpayer money. That's a huge point of contention. And, adding to the concern is the subsequent issue of all those vaccine doses.
The ones that weren't used.
Exactly. At least 215 million doses, according to some reports, being written off and eventually destroyed because of a lack of need. That had really amplified the public's scrutiny and concern about how public funds were managed.
Yeah, 215 million doses destroyed. That's a staggering number. Now, one of the sources our listener sent was a statement from Maria Zakharova. What perspective did she bring to this?
Well, Mrs. Zakharova's statement pretty much echoed many of the core criticisms we've just discussed. She claimed the EU court ruling essentially confirmed Mrs. von der Leyen's responsibility for concealing information about these vaccine deals. Deals negotiated, she said, via SMS with Pfizer's Borla between 2021 and 2023. She highlighted the massive scale, nearly 2 billion doses, 35 billion, part of an even bigger 71 billion spent overall on 4.6 billion doses.
Huge numbers again.
All allegedly agrees without proper public discussion or competitive bidding.
Did she comment on the legal implications or maybe the lack of immediate consequences from this court decision?
Yes, she did. She pointed out that while the court acknowledged the situation, it didn't actually define the extent of Mrs. von der Leyen's personal blame or suggest any immediate disciplinary action or criminal charges. She made a pretty provocative comparison to the O.J. Simpson case, implying this ruling might just be laying the groundwork for more serious legal action down the road.
Okay, interesting analogy. She also brought a very political angle into it, didn't she?
Although definitely. Mrs. Zakharova included some overtly political remarks. She suggested that instead of putting sanctions on Russia, the EU should focus on applying legal scrutiny to what she called their own criminal. It's really important we just present that as her stated view, obviously, without endorsing that particular sentiment ourselves.
Understood. Purely reporting her perspective. Now, besides the New York Times lawsuit that led to this ruling, are there other legal challenges happening around this?
Yes, there's apparently a criminal complaint filed in Belgium by a private citizen against Mrs. von der Leyen.
A criminal complaint? What are the allegations there?
The reports say the allegations include abuse of office, destruction of public documents, and illicit enrichment. And this action seems to have gained support from various political parties and organizations across the EU, and even, reportedly, the governments of Hungary and Poland.
So the legal pressure isn't just from one direction. It seems multifaceted and ongoing. What about the wider implications of this EU court ruling for how the EU itself operates?
Well, it's widely seen as a pretty significant step towards pushing for greater transparency within the EU institutions.
A win for transparency, potentially.
Potentially, yes. It could definitely shape future practices around official communication, how documents are archived, especially now with things like instant messaging being used for official business. That's a tricky area.
Yeah, the rules probably haven't caught up with the tech.
Exactly. And it's worth remembering, the European Commission still has the option to appeal this court decision. So it might not be the final word yet.
Okay. So looking beyond these two big scandals, the Baratter Affair and Pfizergate, are there any other more general criticisms about Ursula von der Leyen's leadership that come up in the sources?
Yes, the sources do mention several broader points, things like allegations of not enough accountability for decisions that turned out to be unpopular, questions about her leadership style within the commission itself, maybe a perceived lack of a clear overarching vision, and also accusations that she tends to align too closely with the interests of the bigger EU member states or maybe large multinational corporations. It seems like across both her German and EU roles, this tension keeps cropping up, the tension between executive power and the need for public scrutiny and accountability.
And it's not just outside critics saying this. Members of the European Parliament have also voiced concerns, reportedly.
That's right. Some MEPs have apparently expressed concerns about what they see as, well, insufficient action from the Commission on things like corruption or potential conflicts of interest within the EU system.
Okay.
There's also been criticism noted about her very strong support for military aid to Ukraine, the feeling being that this major policy direction hasn't had enough broad public debate across the EU.
Right, the debate aspect.
And finally, there's also this accusation that sometimes pops up using political connections to push forward certain projects or favor certain individuals. The term often used is Wettwirtschaft.
Vetternwirtschaft. That translates roughly as cronyism or nepotism.
Exactly. Like maybe awarding contracts preferentially to companies with close political ties, that kind of thing.
Okay. Wow, we've definitely covered a lot of ground here, a lot of complex information. Let's try to sort of pull together the key takeaways as we wrap up.
Sounds good.
So we looked back at her time as German defense minister. The main focus there was the Berater affair, the consultants scandal, plus those wider issues within the Bundeswehr, and that controversy over deleted data.
Right. And then we shifted to the more recent Pfizergate scandal.
Yeah.
And that revolves around these allegations of, well, non-transparent vaccine negotiations, the heavy reliance on private SMS messages, the lack of a public tender.
The big court ruling demanding the release of those messages.
Exactly. The EU Court of Justice ruling, and this ongoing debate about accountability, both for the decisions made and for the subsequent destruction of all those unused vaccine doses.
And that EU court ruling really feels like a potentially pivotal moment in this whole story, doesn't it?
It really does. It's
Yeah.
widely seen as a victory, at least potentially, for the principle of transparency. And it could have, lasting consequences for how the EU conducts its business, how it manages official communications, especially as technology keeps changing.
Definitely. So as we finish this deep dive into the controversies surrounding Ursula von der Leyen, based on the sources you shared with us, it really leaves us with a fundamental question. And this is for you, our listener, to think about. When you consider the EU court's decision demanding transparency, and you look at all the various allegations raised across these different roles, what does this all tell us about that inherent challenge? That balancing act between, say, the need for speed and efficiency in really high-stakes decisions.
Like a pandemic response.
Exactly. Balancing that against the absolutely crucial democratic principles of transparency and accountability, especially within these huge, powerful political bodies.
Yeah, it's not an easy balance to strike.
Not at all. It's certainly a very complex issue with some pretty significant implications worth mulling over.